So I guess this is going to fall under history or education. It's a period of history I've taken more interest in recently, and I mean I've always been fascinated by most history, and this country is no exception. We have had some very turbulent events in our recorded history. And one of the most turbulent periods of British history was the mid 17th century. Um, Now, these events are widely known as the English Civil Wars, but actually, I think there's a case to be made that the English Civil Wars were part of a larger conflict. And academic opinion is sort of shifting in this direction, has been shifting in this direction in more recent years. Now, in terms of terminology, the English Civil War, or more accurately, the English Civil Wars, is really it was internecine conflicts. There was breaks between them. It's generally argued there was three English civil wars, but that term is a lot better known in the public mind than the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Um, I'm just going to quote two sources here that are interesting. I was watching this morning. It's a film I've seen a number of times. To Kill a King. This is about the regicide, the events leading up to the regicide of King Charles I. It's a 2004 film, I believe, or 2003, directed by Mike Barker. It has Rupert Everett as Charles, Tim Roth as Cromwell, Dougray Scott as Thomas Fairfax, and Olivia Williams as Lady Anne Fairfax. Of course, there's going to be some artistic license and inaccuracies, like most historic films have, but I thought it was actually a pretty good take on that period, in part because both the King and Cromwell in this take are neither vilified or uh, deified. You know, they're both shown to be complex and rather difficult men. Cromwell is shown as quite a autocratic figure, but also we see where his motivation lies. The king is equally shown to be stubborn. And I think actually that's one reason why the wars were so brutal, because the two men at the very top, Charles and Cromwell, were both very hard headed. Neither was willing to compromise. So, anyway, if you get an opportunity to Kill a King, it's not a very well known film, but I think it's definitely on the better end of historic films. There's a number of other films. Field in England is also about that period. I haven't seen it yet. I'd like to get around to seeing that one. This book, Civil War, The Wars of the Three Kingdoms by Trevor Royal. It's a thick paperback book. Now, if you look at the dates, 1638 to 1660. So he covers quite a wide time frame throughout the English Civil Wars, but also the Bishops' War, even the famous incident in the Edinburgh Kirk, where a woman known as Jenny Geddes threw a stool and ignited what many thought that was a trigger for the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. It's probably more complex than that, but it's certainly one factor. This goes right up to the restoration of Charles II in 1660. I've just started reading it literally today. As you can see, it's a thick book and I'm a slow reader, but I'm looking forward to getting into this one because I think it's a pivotal time in British history. I say British history. Now, this is the question I want to promote or put out there. What term is more accurate? Should we see these conflicts as separate conflicts, or are they all interlinked to a wider conflict? In other words, the English Civil Wars, the Scottish Civil War, which is a term that isn't, again, not very widely known, but there was actually a Scottish Civil War at the same time. Of course, the wars in Ireland, which were very bloody, and the plantation of Ulster, and those are controversies that go on to this day with the problems in Ireland and Northern Ireland. There, they have very long echoes in history, partly because of Cromwellian atrocities, but also the atrocities in Ulster in 1641. I think of all the conflicts, actually, those in Ireland are the most complex. Um, but cumulatively, these conflicts, cost upwards of 500,000 deaths. That is including civilian deaths, atrocities, battlefield deaths. So it's a pretty major series of wars. When you factor in the population at the time, those really are very heavy casualty statistics. Of course, by the standards of the time, a lot of soldiers on both sides would have died from wounds as opposed to direct battlefield deaths. But in a sense, it marked the beginning of the early modern period because if we look at, for example, the parliamentarian forces, the new model army actually the first de facto British army. And it's interesting. That's why to this day the British Army is not the Royal British Army. It's the British Army, unlike the Royal Air Force or the Royal Navy, because it was set up by parliamentarians. It was set up by Republicans. That's an ironic thing. Although Charles III is commander in chief, and it's very much patriotic, and it's very heart of the British establishment. It started off as a Republican force. That's the irony. Um, the way I look at it is the conflicts are distinct in the sense that there were specific issues, for example, in England, it was very much specifically between the king's prerogative and parliament, and families were divided. It was so the term English Civil War is very accurate because that's what they were. But the conflicts in Scotland, for example, the Royalist support later on for Prince Charles, later King Charles II, Cromwell's invasion of Scotland, it's very obvious that these conflicts were interlinked. And I mean, I would argue the battles of Alford and Kilsyth were just as bloody as Naseby and Worcester. Um, Ireland even goes into the realm of, it's been argued to be genocide, what Cromwell's forces done there. I'm not going to speak too much about Ireland in this video simply because it's interlinked, but I think that's a even more complex issue. In England, it's not black and white, but it is, the king versus parliament. That was the crux of the conflicts in England. In Ireland, it gets into more about the Protestant plantations, Catholic majority, British colonialism. There's all sorts of questions that get into the conflicts in Ireland. There was actually atrocities in all nations. In Ireland, it's remembered the Siege of Drogheda, for example, but there were atrocities in England as well. For example, the Siege of Bolton, and even allowing for propaganda on both sides, I think it's pretty obvious that there were atrocities. In the case of Bolton, Royalist forces were thought to have massacred 1,500 townspeople. This may be an exaggeration. There was another incident in Nottinghamshire where Royalists were massacred after surrendering. So, like all civil wars, it was brutal, brutal days. Um, in Scotland, there were massacres after the Battle of Aberdeen and Dundee. Um, but these conflicts really shaped the course of British history, and in a way, although they're quite well documented, I'm surprised there isn't even more films about this period. Because, I mean, when you think about it, the regicide of Charles I occurred 150 years before the arguably better documented French Revolution and their regicide of Louis XVI. This was 150 years before. Of course, the difference is we restored the monarchy. Um, One interesting thing this film does is shows the tensions between two former friends in Fairfax and Cromwell. Fairfax could arguably be called a more moderate parliamentarian. He was not one of the regicides who signed for the king's death. Probably he was divided because his family was royalist or his wife was royalist. Um, he was a parliamentarian. This was typical. A lot of families were divided. But I think in this film, Fairfax is shown to be the most moderate man. Both Charles and Cromwell come across as stubborn. The regicide scene itself, the execution of the king, I think it's depicted quite well. I think Rupert Everett was great at that role. It shows as he's going to the scaffold. It was a freezing January morning, 1649. The people were literally touching him. This actually occurred outside the banqueting hall in Whitehall. Most executions of royals have been at Tower Hill, but not Charles. That was in Whitehall. He wore an extra vest that day so he wouldn't shiver because it was a freezing day. He didn't say much. But the cult of the martyr king became a thing afterwards. So actually, by killing the king, Cromwell only martyrized him. But Cromwell changed the course of British history and arguably European history. because other revolutions in Europe were inspired by the Cromwellian parliamentary revolution in Britain. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. I just think it was a very interesting period of history. I'd like to see a field in England. I would conclude by saying the English Civil War is an accurate description. It was a distinct conflict, and upwards of 190,000 people died in those conflicts. That's including, battlefield deaths, civilian atrocities, and other war-related factors. Up to 70,000 in Scotland, and possibly a quarter of a million in Ireland, including the atrocities. So this really was a costly series of conflicts. Of course, earlier, and actually the prelude in this book, is the 30 Years' War, which ravaged Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. It starts off with the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. Now, a lot of the veterans of that battle, a decade later, found themselves in the English Civil Wars. So that's interesting. People like Alexander Leslie. Um, in a sense, the 30 Years' War in Germany was sort of a prelude to what was going to happen in the British Isles. Even though Charles managed to keep Britain somewhat out of those conflicts, notwithstanding the mercenaries, um, we ended up, seeing it basically on British soil. And it has been called both the 30 Years' War and the Wars of the Three Kingdoms has been termed the Balkans of the 17th century. In other words, a powder keg. But fascinating period, very important period of our history. What I would say before I close this video, I mentioned the Scottish Civil War. It's interesting that the Jacobite risings seem to be better remembered in Scotland because, in terms of actual casualties, they were far, far less than the Scottish Civil War. For example, in the three Jacobite risings between 1689, actually four Jacobite risings, between 1689 and 1746, total battlefield deaths were perhaps 15,000. In the Scottish Civil War, that is the period of the 1640s going into the 1650s, it was far, far higher, at least 70,000. And there were battles of that period called Scythe, Alford, Philiphaugh, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, um, Tippermuir, that were more devastating than the later Jacobite risings. Also, another thing about the Jacobite risings, sometimes they're falsely presented as England versus Scotland. It's a lot more complex than that. It was the Hanoverians versus the Stuarts, but that's for another video. Anyway, if you appreciate history like myself, get your hands on this. Trevor Royal, Civil War, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, published in 2004, but it's very well written, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. It covers all sorts of things. Fascinating period of history, very turbulent and tragic period of history, but very, very important. I think, in a sense, it was the beginning of the early modern period of British history. Um, Fascinating stuff. Let me know your thoughts.